High Court will hand down decisions on a number of landmark issues. Those major decisions could come as early as today. Among them, a decision on Prop 8. That's the same-sex marriage ban. It was approved by California voters in 2008. Supporters appealed to the High Court after a lower court found it unconstitutional. Also at issue, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, signed by President Clinton in 1996 to keep the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriage in states where it's legal. A particular section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is being challenged as outdated. It requires states with a history of discriminating against minorities to get federal approval before changing their election laws. We could get a key decision on affirmative action as well. In that case, admission to a Texas university is arguing the school was wrong to use race as a factor in its admission process. Another groundbreaking decision that could come down as soon as today is whether companies should be allowed to own patents on human genes. For a look at how the court could rule on these landmark cases, I'm joined by, of course, NBC's justice correspondent Pete Williams. So, Pete, June is always where the controversial decisions, the ones that take the longest amount of time for the opinions to be written and all that, and that's why they wait till June. Anything about the decisions that have come before June? Any of the analysis that you've seen of how the justices are interacting with one another give you a clue of what we're looking at for the next 4 weeks?
That's easy. No.
Fair enough. What is it that we should expect as each one goes on? On gay marriage, there are two major decisions. Walk us through them.
Okay, so as we do so, remember, we're basing this on, to some extent, the justices past voting to the extent that they've looked at these issues before, and secondly, oral argument. But that's just the beginning. We don't know what's been going on as the opinions circulate. Remember, most people, me included, thought that the court was going to strike down the Obamacare law. So with that caution, here we go on what we think is going to happen. On Prop 8, we think that the Supreme Court is basically going to say this case was not properly before the court, that the people who support Proposition 8, who stood in for the state to appeal the decision striking it down, didn't have the legal standing to do so. That would leave the lower court rulings in effect that declared Prop 8 unconstitutional, and it would allow same-sex marriage to resume in California. On DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, it did seem like that the court is prepared to actually get to the merits of the case and say that it's unconstitutional for a mixture of reasons, both that it interferes with the normal federalism rule that the states get to decide what a legal marriage is, and secondly, that it's unconstitutional discrimination. So we move on to the two cases involved. On the Voting Rights Act, the so-called pre-clearance requirement, it did seem that the majority of the justices are quite skeptical of this, and the court did seem prepared, at least during oral arguments, to strike that down. That would gut the Voting Rights Act. It would leave part of it intact, but if they go that far, it would be a big setback for the civil rights community. The other civil rights issue is affirmative action. Here again, it seemed that the Supreme Court was quite skeptical of it. It didn't seem like the Supreme Court was going to say that public colleges, and that's who's at issue here, cannot ever use affirmative action, but it did seem likely that they're going to scale it back. How they'll do so, I don't know, and we've been waiting for this decision since it was argued in October.
I was just going to say, 7 months, right? Yeah, an unbelievable amount of time.
Yeah, and of course, one of the issues there may be that Justice Elena Kagan is recused, so that leaves just 8. And they want to try to avoid a 4-4 tie, which would just leave the lower court ruling intact. It would be as though the Supreme Court never had the case. And then on the human gene case, the court seemed quite skeptical that you can patent human genes. This case has achieved a little more notoriety. This is the breast cancer test that Angelina Jolie used. And the company, Myriad Genetics in Utah, that does these tests, claims a patent not only on the test itself, but also on the genes out of the human body. And the question is, can you patent human genes? Can you patent anything that's a product of nature? The company says, well, look, to do the test, we actually have to modify the gene somewhat. We have to sort of strip away these proteins that code the gene, that protect it, and in doing so, we're creating something new. The court seemed very skeptical of that. But when we'll get these decisions, I don't know. They have 28 cases left to decide. We probably have maybe half a dozen more decision days, and we just don't know when they're coming.
Well, Pete, when we see you standing in front of the Supreme Court, we know it may be one of those days. So we will let you go and find out.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
You bet. You bet.
So we'll be keeping our eye on the Supreme Court this morning. Any of these big days.